once I put my password into my iPad. Hopefully we'll have it coming up in a second. But tonight we're looking at this whole subject of hope. Is there life after life? It used to be that people didn't talk about sex in polite company. That's, of course, changed. But there is still one thing that people don't often talk about publicly, and that is talking about death. Despite the fact that 1 out of 1 people die, the statistics are pretty standard, we don't talk about it. We don't think about it, or at least we don't think about it in public. And when people do talk about it, they often joke about it. Woody Allen famously said, "I'm not scared of dying, I just don't want to be there when it happens." Because I guess maybe out of all the things that we have in our culture, death is one of the things that we don't have an answer to. Science, technology has dealt with so many things, and they're wonderful things to have, but do we have an answer to the problem of death? J.K. Rowling, in her books, the Harry Potter books, talks and thinks a lot about the subject of death, and she said, "My books are largely about death. Why? Because we're all frightened of it." And of course, when we think about death, one of the big questions is there anything beyond it? Is there life after life? And different people have different opinions. If I was to ask around this room, I guess people would have different ideas. Some people say, well, there is nothing. When you die, that's it. Because when you ask a dead person what happens, they say nothing. So there must be nothing after death. And often it's suggested that such a view would mean that we should enjoy life now. If death is the end, and if this life is the only one we've got, then make the most of it. Have fun. Do what you want, because death will end it. Enjoy life now. But actually, some of the philosophers and thinkers that have really taken this existential and atheistic view to its logical conclusions have come to very different conclusions. They've come to the realization that if death is the end, and if this life is all there is, what is the point of all of it? Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, said, "Man is a crumpled piece of paper in the rain whose only liberation is death." Pretty depressing view of life. Bertrand Russell, the atheistic philosopher, also said this about death. "Man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving. His origin, growth, hopes and fears, loves and beliefs are but the outcome of an accidental collocation of atoms. All the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins." And then get this. "Only within the scaffolding of these truths, on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built." He says, actually, if death is the end, not just for us, but for the universe, for the solar system, what is the point of all of my life, my education, my efforts, even my charitable works, my help for society, if all of it one day will end in nothing? Or listen to this. This is the head of the British Humanist Association in the UK, recently said, "From the humanist point of view, life leads to nothing. It is nothing but a cruel disappointment." And so actually saying that this life is all there is may not be such an optimistic view of life after all. When you start to consistently think it through, it's pretty depressing. Well, other people say, well, maybe death is not the end. Very popular increasingly in Britain today is the idea of reincarnation. And people say, well, hopefully, perhaps there'll be another chance after death. Maybe I can get another chance to live it again. And of course, this is influenced from a kind of Eastern worldview of Buddhism and such like, where we live again and again in an endless cycle, almost, of reincarnations. And it seems quite attractive to some people. It seems a positive idea that at least we might get another crack at this life. But there's, of course, some problems with the view. Firstly, there's absolutely no evidence that it's true. And secondly, if you actually look consistently at where this worldview comes from in an Eastern mindset, it's not actually you that's reincarnated. It's not yourself that's reincarnated, just your karma. There's not a conscious continuance of who you are. And the aim of it is not actually to be reincarnated at all. Ultimately, the aim is to end up in nirvana, in nothingness, to escape physicality in this world. So it's quite different to what we might expect. And then, of course, other people say, well, maybe there's something else. Maybe there's paradise, heaven, hell. We don't know. Different ideas. But, of course, the big question I guess most of us have is this. How would we know? How would we know whether it's nothing, reincarnation, heaven for all, or whatever? Because all of us stand on this side of death. All of us are very inexperienced when it comes to this question. And all of us are just guessing, aren't we? I know you get people who've had near-death experiences, and they talk about the possibility of life after death, but I wouldn't want to build my whole life on the foundation of someone's experience that may just be their brain shutting down. Is there anything else that we can go on? Is there anyone qualified to speak about this? Let me give you an illustration. Last year in January, I was in South Africa, and I was just near this point. This is the southern tip of Africa, Cape Point, just south of Cape Town. And I went down there. It's a beautiful place to visit. And I was reading up about the history of this part of the world. Up until 500 years ago, no one from Europe had ever made it past this point in a boat. This is the point where the waters of the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans meet, and the strong currents and the storms meet. That when sailors got to this point around the coast of Africa, they normally got shipwrecked on the rocks. No one had made it beyond. No one had come back to tell the tale. That was until 1497. A Portuguese sailor named Vasco da Gama set off from Portugal, went down the west coast of Africa, round the southern tip, all the way to India, and back again. And what happened as a result of that is that the name of this place was changed. Originally, until 500 years ago, it was called the Cape of Storms, because it was a place of death and destruction and the unknown. But afterwards, it was changed to the Cape of Good Hope, as it's known today. Why? Because someone had been past it and had come back to tell the tale. Someone had been there and said that this place of death and despair could actually be a place of hope. And the Bible says, actually, there is one person that has done that with death, and that is the person of Jesus. He's the one person that, as it were, has sailed through death and has come back to tell us that this place of fear can actually be a place of hope. This place of death could actually be a place of life. He's the one person in all of history uniquely qualified to tell us about this question of life after death. So we're going to have read to us now an account of Jesus' resurrection, and you'll find it in your little books on your tables, and you can turn there with me to page 164. Right at the back, it's the very last chapter of Luke's account of Jesus' life. And we're going to start reading, page 158 we're going to start reading. And we're going to start reading where it says chapter or number 24, halfway down. Great.
On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, and the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. While they were still talking about this, page 162, verse 36. It's Jesus appears to the disciples. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. He said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. He told them, "This is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. I am going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high." Amen.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, you can keep those open because we're going to look at that claim now just for a few moments. The claim that Jesus not only died, as we thought about last night, but rose again. Now, I'm aware when I say that, there's probably quite a few of you who are saying, "Yeah, but hang on a minute, you don't actually expect me to believe that, do you? A nice fairy story, but you're actually saying that this happened in real space-time history?" And actually, I would say yes. And so I want us to spend a few moments looking now at the evidence why I think that's not such a ridiculous proposition at all. I'm aware that when we come to this, we must think, well, the resurrection seems so unlikely. I mean, statistically, one out of the all of history. Very unlikely. Medically, it's unrepeatable. You'll be glad to know we're not going to try and do it again tonight. We haven't put anything in your sweets, don't worry. But actually, what is surprising for many people is that historically, when you start to investigate the first century evidence that we have for the resurrection, it is not as ridiculous as is first claimed. And what surprises a lot of people, that even amongst scholars that aren't Christians and who don't accept that Jesus is alive, there is still a great agreement over the evidence surrounding this claim. And so I want to just look at 5 pieces of evidence briefly that even scholars who don't agree with the resurrection often accept as true, and then we'll see what we make of them. And the first is this: we know that Jesus died. We know that not only from biblical sources, but from extra-biblical sources. There was a historical Jesus who died under the Roman governorship of Pontius Pilate, and he was dead. The Romans were good at crucifying people, and we know that they did it a lot, and we know that actually there was only one instance ever of someone surviving crucifixion, and that was some friends of Josephus, the Jewish historian, who was one day walking along and saw 3 of his friends being executed by crucifixion, appealed to the governor to have them taken down, and despite the best medical treatment, 2 of them still died of their injuries. No other record we have of anyone surviving crucifixion. Jesus died. There's lots of records for it. That's the first thing. Secondly, Jesus was buried. Each of the gospel accounts we have in the Bible tell us that Jesus was buried in the tomb of a man called Joseph of Arimathea. Now, that doesn't mean much to us, but he was a member of the ruling council that as a whole had condemned Jesus to death. A strange detail to add this man's tomb to the story if it were not in fact authentic. And because there's no competing account available to us, most historians would suggest that this is accurate, that Jesus really was buried in this man's tomb. The third thing we know is that Jesus' tomb was found to be empty 3 days after the crucifixion took place. And very interestingly, each of the gospel accounts tell us that it was women that were the first people to find that the tomb was empty. Now, this is interesting, not necessarily immediately so to us, but when you discover that in the first century, women were not regarded as reliable witnesses in a court of law, it's fascinating that they are the first witnesses of the event, the biggest event in the whole of the gospel, the resurrection. And it does make you think, doesn't it? If these gospel writers were fabricating their story and making it up from scratch, and if they could have chosen anyone they liked to have been the witnesses for this event that really didn't take place, why would you create as your first and biggest witnesses people who in your culture were not regarded as reliable? Of course, we know women are just as reliable as men, but they didn't see that as such in that culture. And so it gives us a good deal of confidence that this account is actually reliable. There's other reasons too, partly to say that Christianity could have never spread if the tomb had been not empty. The whole thing wouldn't have even got off the ground. The body would have still been there. And also there's a very interesting little detail that was discovered a few years ago in an archaeological dig near Nazareth. And that was a decree that was given just a few years after these events by a Roman governor, saying that the penalty for robbing a grave or for interfering with a grave was death. Now, most historians would regard that as a rather severe penalty for not such a great crime. And it seems, if you read between the lines, that maybe the authorities were trying to close the gate after the horse had bolted. News of the empty tomb had spread, and they were trying to make amends for it later on. But there seems to be good evidence to say that this account is authentic. The women did go and find that the tomb that had previously contained the body of Jesus was now empty on the first day of the week. Then there's a fourth thing too. Lots of people had claimed that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. Sometimes individuals, sometimes a couple of people, sometimes a crowd of 500 people all at once. Now, it's often suggested that these are hallucinations. And indeed, sometimes hallucinations do take place in certain places to certain types of people after the death of someone close to you. But actually, there are very good reasons for suggesting that these are not hallucinations. Firstly, they take place in different places and at different times. That's unlike what normally happens with hallucination. They take place not just to individuals, but to whole groups of people at the same time. And they exist for a set period of time, for 40 days after the resurrection, and they stop all of a sudden. Normally, hallucinations carry on for weeks, months, even years after the date of the person's death. And so again, we have to grapple with the fact that these people seem to have seen something, and it's not just a hallucination, and they're so convinced by what they've seen that almost all of them are willing to go to their deaths over it. And then there's a fifth thing too, the growth of the church in the first century. Now this again is really important. We know from historical and archaeological studies that the church in the first century grew massively, exponentially after these events. And it spread right across Asia, across Europe, down to North Africa. And it spread on this claim that Jesus was the Messiah and that he had risen from the dead. And where did this whole movement start that was to become the biggest sociological phenomenon in history? It started in the very place where these events were meant to have taken place, and in the very weeks after they meant to have happened. Which leaves us the question, if they had not happened, if the tomb was still filled with Jesus' body, how on earth did this movement ever get credibility when all of the Jewish and Roman authorities were investing every bit of energy they had in trying to stop it? And yet this movement grew on the very claim that this was true. So there's 5 pieces of evidence. Jesus died. Jesus was buried. People found that the tomb was empty. People claimed they'd seen Jesus risen from the dead. And the church grew on this claim of the resurrection. And no one could stop this thing from spreading, no matter how hard they tried. Now there's 5 pieces of evidence. And they would be supported even by those who don't necessarily believe in the resurrection. But the question you have to come to once you look at the evidence is this. If that's the evidence we have, what do we have and what do we make of it? Now what I suggest we have is a resurrection-sized hole right in the middle of history that only the resurrection could fill. Now that's not to say, of course, that everybody necessarily believes in the resurrection. But if you're not going to believe in the resurrection, if you're going to say it hadn't happened, it didn't happen, you've got to come up with an alternative to make sense of the evidence, because it's there. And so people have tried to do it. And so they've suggested different things. Let's just have a look at a few of them. Firstly, some people say, well, maybe Jesus didn't actually die. He passed out on the cross, he came to in the tomb, he got out to see his disciples, they thought he was risen from the dead, the whole thing started on a delusion, on a mistake. Actually, let's rewind a moment and think that one through a bit more seriously. Jesus didn't really die. Well, first of all, we know that the Romans were very good at crucifying people. We've already said that there was only one account of someone escaping crucifixion when they were deliberately taken down. And what's more, we know that the Roman soldiers that were crucifying Jesus would have known that if the person that they were crucifying got away alive, it was their life in the place of the one that got away. They had good vested interests in making sure they got the job done. And in fact, to make sure they got the job done, we're told that they thrust a spear into Jesus' side and blood and water flowed out separately. That would have meant nothing to people at the time. But a medic today will tell you that was proof that death had occurred. Now let's imagine even all of that hasn't happened, and somehow Jesus still is alive as he's taken off the cross. You've then got to suggest that this man was passed between lots of loving pairs of hands of his disciples who would have looked for any trace of life. And then he's wrapped up in a lot of cloth all round so he can't move. Even worse than I was in my brown paper package. He really was a fragile man. And then he's placed in a tomb, and a huge stone is placed in the entrance, and a Roman guard of many soldiers is put outside. And you've got to suggest that somehow Jesus, after torture, physical beating, and crucifixion, comes round in the tomb. It's nice and cool. He then manages to unwrap all of the grave clothes and get out of them somehow, how I don't know. He then wraps them all up again to make it look like his, clothes are still there. He pushes this massive stone away, beats it past the Roman guards, and turns up to his disciples and convinces them that he's not a wounded invalid in need of urgent medical care, but he's the Lord of the universe who's risen from the dead. Doesn't really do it for me. I'm not sure about you. Anyone who had suffered that kind of crucifixion wouldn't have been able to walk, let alone convince his disciples that he was the Lord of the universe risen from the dead. It just doesn't work. Well, other people say, okay, maybe they went to the wrong tomb. Maybe, it was early in the morning. People say, I've heard other people say, well, they were women. They don't get their directions very good. Of course, I wouldn't say that. Or I've heard other people say, maybe they were using their, Apple Maps and they got Jesus' tomb marked in the wrong place. Should have been using Google Maps. But anyway, they got to the tomb, they got to the wrong tomb, they saw it was empty, and they went and started preaching the resurrection, and that was what happened, okay? Well, let's just imagine for a minute that somehow all of the disciples had all independently gone to the wrong tomb and had started preaching the resurrection. What do you think the Jewish and Roman authorities would have done the minute this new movement started gaining credibility? It would have been very easy, wouldn't it? As soon as Peter stood up and started preaching Jesus alive, they'd have said, don't be stupid, you numpty. That wasn't Jesus' tomb, that was Auntie Joan's tomb. Jesus' tomb is down the road. They'd have brought out the body, the whole thing would have fallen apart. The disciples would have been the biggest idiots in town. They couldn't have gone to the wrong tomb. Well, what about this? Maybe the body was moved. Well, of course, the question is, moved by who? Grave robbers? Well, why would grave robbers go in and leave the only thing of value in the tomb, the grave clothes, behind and take away the bloody corpse? Secondly, the Jewish authorities? Well, of course, they wouldn't want to move the tomb. They wanted the guard in the place, in the tomb, making sure that the body wasn't going to be moved. And if somehow it had been, they would have made sure it would have been reported and the whole thing would have been covered in detail. The Roman authorities, well, likewise, they didn't want this movement spreading. They wanted everyone to know that Jesus was still dead. So, of course, the most likely option, you would say, would be the disciples. Maybe they wanted to take the body to con people into thinking that the resurrection was true. But again, a few problems with that. First, as we'll see in a moment, I don't think the disciples were expecting the resurrection. They were a disheartened group of individuals for whom the crucifixion was the end of all their hopes. The Messiah figure is beaten by the Romans and killed on a Roman cross. That was it. And let's say, for instance, they had somehow got to the tomb and somehow got past the Roman guards and stolen the body and hidden it in one of their attics. What would have happened when, after they started preaching this message of resurrection, people started getting persecuted for it? What do you think would have happened? Chuck Colson was involved in the Watergate scandal in the United States. He later became a Christian, and he said, when the pressure is on, someone normally shouts. When the pressure is on, someone normally shouts. And these disciples, to a man, went to their deaths over the claim of the resurrection. Now, don't get me wrong. Some people, of course, have died for things that aren't true. But the difference is the disciples would have died for something that they knew wasn't true. And yet each one of them did. Why? So that doesn't seem to work. Well, what else do you have? Well, here's one that was put forward by a scholar in America recently in debate. He said maybe Jesus had a twin brother. Now you laugh, but actually I have to say this was a serious proposition that was put forward. He said maybe Jesus was born an identical twin. His twin for some reason was separated at birth. The twin heard that Jesus had died, turned up at Jerusalem for the funeral. The disciples mistook him for Jesus and started preaching the resurrection. But I don't think you need me to go through that one to show you how really, in the face of the evidence, it doesn't really make sense, does it? What about the body that was still in the tomb, for a start? You see, what happens is when you start to look at the alternatives, and I'm going to say, in the face of the evidence, you've got to have an alternative if you're not going to go for the resurrection. When you look at the alternatives, they seem more incredible than the original proposition. Incredible though resurrection seems, these seem even more so when you look at the evidence. Now, some of you are sitting there saying, but hang on a minute. I'm not that easily convinced. I'm an intelligent, 21st century student. I got into Glasgow. I wasn't at Strathclyde or, at Cali or any of those. I got into Glasgow. I'm clever. And I'm not going to be taken in by these kind of talks of resurrection. Those first century disciples, they were just a bunch of, simple guys. But I'm not going to believe this. Well, actually, can I just suggest this? I think that for the first century followers of Jesus to believe the resurrection was actually a bigger intellectual and cultural barrier than it is for us, but just for different reasons. You see, the first century followers of Jesus, many of the first ones were Jews. And for a Jew to believe that God had come into this world in the form of a man, had lived and died on a Roman cross, the hands of their hated enemies, and then 3 days later rise from the dead in the middle of history, can I tell you, that was no more part of their expectations of what is likely or possible than it is part of our expectations of what is likely or possible. Can I tell you why? If you were to read through, and I do encourage you to take this and read it through, if you were to read through this gospel, you'll see that before the crucifixion, Jesus, on several occasions, predicts both his death and his resurrection. He says, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to die, 3 days later, I'll rise again. It's going to happen. He says it over and over again. Jesus goes to Jerusalem. He dies on a cross. And 3 days later, what is happening? Well, you might expect to find this. You might expect to have the disciples having a little conflab. Guys, it's the third day. You remember what Jesus said was going to happen on the third day? Let's get down to the tomb and see if it's happened yet. But you don't see that, do you? What do you see? The blokes are still probably in bed, and the women are going to anoint a dead body, or at least that's what they think, because they don't expect the resurrection to happen, even though Jesus said it was going to happen. It was no more part of their worldview as it is part of ours. They didn't believe it because it neatly fitted with their expectations. They believed it because they were convinced it was true. Now, I'm going to say, to believe the resurrection does cut in the face of a lot of the expectations of 21st century Western thinking. But actually, don't believe it because it's easy or you're inclined to. Believe it if the evidence persuades you of it. And I think if you're willing to look at the evidence, the reasonable conclusion in the face of it is that it happens. And those that have most looked into it and most grappled with it have discovered that to be the case. I wonder if you've heard of this guy, Sir Lionel Luckhoo. Anyone heard of him? Probably not. You might have heard of this guy, Lionel Hutz, okay, in The Simpsons. And what you may not know is that Lionel Hutz, the lawyer in The Simpsons, is actually based on this real-life character, Sir Lionel Luckhoo. The irony is that Sir Lionel Luckhoo is in the Guinness Book of Records as the world's most successful lawyer. He's never lost a case. Whereas, of course, Lionel Hutz is the world's worst lawyer. He's never won a case. Kind of irony. But Lionel Luckhoo, not Lionel Hutz, said this. He's also become a Christian and is convinced of the resurrection. He said, I say unequivocally, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves no room, absolutely no room, for doubts. He's used to looking at the evidence, weighing it up, coming to conclusions. That's his conclusion. Or let's take another guy, Sir Edward Clarke, High Court lawyer. And he said, as a lawyer, I have made a prolonged study of the evidences for the events of the first Easter day. To me, the evidence is conclusive. And over again in the High Court, I have secured the verdict on evidence not nearly so compelling. And again, I could show you lawyers and historians that have investigated the evidence and come to that conclusion. And those that ridicule Christianity most readily haven't actually done so. Bertrand Russell wrote a book, Why I'm Not a Christian. Didn't even mention the evidence of the resurrection. And yet it's the very foundation on which Christianity is built. If you're willing to check it out, think the evidence stacks up. It actually happens. Well, you might be saying, okay, well, if it did happen, what does it matter? So what? What are the implications of this for us? Well, as we come towards a close, let me just give you 4, very briefly, implications of this. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, what does that mean? Firstly, I think it means the future is certain. At lunchtime today, I quoted this, and we'll look at it again. In the book of Acts, in the New Testament, Paul, one of the early Christian leaders, is preaching in the city of Athens, and he's speaking to a group of intellectual philosophers, and at the end of his talk, he says, God has set a day, it's not on the screen, okay, I'll just give it to you. God has set a day when he'll judge the world with justice by the man he's appointed, and he's given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. He said there will be a day in the future when God will judge this world, and the person who will judge it is the same one who rose from the dead, Jesus Christ. He's saying all of history is heading towards a day when people will stand before Jesus Christ. And the assurance of that is because Jesus rose from the dead. The future is certain. Can we just pause a moment and say, if that is true, it's probably worth thinking through, isn't it? If ultimately all of history in my life is pointing towards a day when I will stand before this person who rose from the dead, the implications of that would be kind of big, right? I'll give you an illustration. A few years ago, I was driving from my house in Bournemouth up to Suffolk, sleepy Suffolk, and I was going to speak at a church, and I was kind of doing all right. I was on time, so I wasn't breaking the speed limit, as far as I knew, and I was going down this dual carriageway, driving about 69 miles an hour. Came round the corner underneath a bridge, and I saw at the side of the road a policeman pointing one of those speed guns at my car. So I quickly looked down at my speedo and saw that I was doing just under 70, so I breathed a sigh of relief and thought, phew. But then I looked to the side of the police car and I saw a big red circle with the numbers 50 in the middle of it, and suddenly my heart sank. Of course, by this point I was past the police car, so I looked in my rearview mirror and I saw that the policeman was now quickly getting into his police car, putting on his blue flashing lights, and was pulling out into the road behind me. Now, of course, by this point I was now several hundred yards past the police car. And I have to confess, the first thing that came into my mind at this point was this. If you floor it, you can beat him. I don't know why it came, and it only stayed there for a second or two until reason took over, but it was there. And then I thought, hang on a minute, Michael, he's already got your number plates. And even if you do manage to beat him for now, he's going to catch up with you later. Wouldn't it be better to pull over and face up to the consequences? Now, it's a silly illustration, but the thing is this. Maybe some of us might have a sneaking suspicion that there might be some truth in what I've said tonight. You've started, as you've heard the stuff this week, to realize maybe this is true. But actually, some of us are tempted to say, I'll just kind of push that to the back of my mind. I'll forget about it. I won't really think it through. I'll just ignore it and hope it's not really there. But actually, if it is true, wouldn't it be better to think it through now rather than to think it through later? Rather than just suppressing it and trying to forget it? If this is what the future holds, worth being serious about it. The future is certain. But secondly, though, not only is the future certain, but the past can be forgiven. Last night we were looking at Jesus' death and what that means. And we were saying that Jesus' death on the cross was not an accident, but it was a deliberate plan by God that all our sin, all our wrong could be forgiven, paid for. Not just the wrong of the actions that we do, but the wrong of the attitude that says to God, God, just keep out of my life. And God goes to a cross and he dies taking our place, paying the penalty so that we can be forgiven. But of course the question remains, how do we know it happened? How do we know that Jesus' claims are really true? And the answer is in the resurrection. It's like the receipt that the payment has been made. You know when you take your credit card and you're not sure whether you've got enough money left? And there's that nervous moment when the receipt is printed and you want to check, it doesn't say void, but it says paid. And when the resurrection happens, it's like the receipt that says paid in full. All that Jesus died for was really accomplished. That all of our wrong, all of our sin, the big stuff, the small stuff, the stuff of the past, the present, and the future, the stuff that we've forgotten about, the stuff we wish we could forget about, all of it's wiped clean. I was reading in the student paper earlier about people desperately trying to wipe clean their Facebook accounts before they get a job. That kind of hope that we could just get rid of the past, but we're worried that there's still something there. And isn't that like life sometimes? That stuff that we wish we could get rid of, but Jesus says it can be. Wiped clean. Not saved on any hard disks. It's gone. And that means we don't need to fear that future day if Jesus is the judge, because Jesus is also the one that's dealt with our wrong. On that day, he's going to say, actually, I've already dealt with all of that stuff. It's gone. We don't need to fear it. Because not only is the future certain, the past can be forgiven. Number 3, today matters. Right at the beginning, we said that our view of the future affects our life now. If death is the end, then life is actually quite bleak. What is the point of your studies, your relationships, your work, your efforts? Ultimately, it's pointless. And if religion that says, I one day go to heaven and leave this world behind, if that's true, then equally our life now is pointless because it doesn't really matter. But the Bible says that because Jesus rose from the dead physically, he has made physical hope possible for these bodies and for this world. That's why the biblical hope is not that we float off to heaven, but this world is renewed and transformed. It's an incredible hope that one day this world will have all the wrong, the rubbish, all taken away. Justice will be done. Suffering will end. Hope for this world. And if there's hope for this world and for these bodies, if I'm trusting Jesus, that means that what I do in this world and what I do with this body does matter. It's not just going to get burnt up. And I'm not just going to leave it all behind. It means that everything matters, not just going to church and reading the Bible. It means that my studies matter, my friendships matter. Everything matters. Sport, art, literature, music, it all matters if Jesus rose from the dead. Life matters now, and it really is worth living. And then fourthly, what difference does it make? There is hope. Someone said, humanity can't live without hope. But actually, most of our hopes are only temporary at best. But the Bible says there is an ultimate hope that goes not just through this life, but through death as well. I love the Lord of the Rings films, don't know about you. And I love, at the end of the second film, The Two Towers, there's this beautiful moment when Frodo and Samwise are talking together. Do you remember the scene? The mountains of Mordor. You have to roll your R's, or at least try. They're looking bleak and dark. The sky is growing dark and hope seems to be lost. And it seems that everything is going to end in despair. And then Sam turns to Frodo. And Sam's my favorite character, by the way. Sam turns to Frodo and he says, it's like in the old stories, Mr. Frodo. The ones that really mattered. Like the Bible. He didn't say that. Full of darkness and death they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end. How could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was after so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. And when the sun shines, it will shine out all the brighter. Those are the stories that stay with you, Mr. Frodo, even though you're too young to understand why. It's beautiful. And it's beautiful because it's true. Because Tolkien, as a Christian, was writing about what he believed, that there was a day when the sun would shine again. Not just to shine again, but to shine out the brighter. There was hope. And that hope has given countless millions down through the centuries and across this world a reason to keep going in the face of bleak suffering and despair. Let me just give you one story. Joni Eareckson Tada was an athletic teenage girl living in the States. And one summer's day, she dived off a pontoon into a lake, but she didn't know that it was too shallow. Her head hit the bottom, her neck broke instantly. She was rushed to hospital, and despite the best medical care, she was a quadriplegic for the rest of her life. She lived in a wheelchair, not able to move anything beneath her neck. But this is what she says as a Christian. I can scarcely believe it. I, with shriveled, bent fingers, atrophied muscles, and no feeling from the shoulders down, will one day have a new body, light, bright, and clothed in righteousness, powerful and dazzling. Can you imagine this hope this gives someone spinal cord injured like me? Or someone who is cerebral palsied or brain injured? Imagine the hope this gives to someone who's manic depressive. No other religion, no other philosophy promises new bodies, hearts, and minds. Only in the gospel of Christ do hurting people find such incredible hope. You see, it's real, and it makes all the difference. Well, we're going to hear another story now of someone, not in America, but someone from this university, your very own university, who's also come to discover that hope and this Jesus, this living Jesus at work in her life. And hopefully it's going to come up on the screen in just a second, if the guys can get it working. And we're going to have a look and see the difference that this has made for her as well. So let's have a look.
I love people and being part of things, being in the midst of a group and being known. My family's really important to me, and I've always been really lucky that we're so close. My greatest fear has always been that I'd be left out or left behind or deserted. Until my dad died when I was 12, life was pretty simple, and my faith in Jesus hadn't really been tested. It felt like my whole world fell apart. I lost all the security I'd known, and I couldn't believe that the God I thought I knew would let this happen. It was the worst thing I've ever been through, and it was a whole mix of anger and hurt and loneliness. But through great friends and an amazing church, I slowly learned that God was so much more than I'd known before Dad died. He's not distant or controlling or floating above the mess of our lives. He doesn't promise us that everything will go well, but He will most certainly be with us through it all. I kept coming across bits of the Bible that spoke directly to me. God reassured me that He knew me and loved me, and that He understood just how rubbish everything was at that point. God is not only for the good times. He can handle our pain and our anger. Jesus wept when His friend died, and God is with us when we do the same. I saw that I could trust God, not only to make sure that I was happy, but because He's real and He is faithful. When Jesus died on the cross to allow me to experience this closeness with God, He also went through the separation of death. He knows how much it hurts. I'm still scared of being abandoned, of someone leaving or dying. And when I love someone now, I know just how awful it would be if they weren't around anymore. I still miss my dad. God makes great people, and I'll always wish He was here. But my faith is now based on knowing that God promises to be with us, and that one day there'll be no more death or separation. I trust Him on that. He has been true to His word in so many other ways. I've seen it in my life so far, and I know it will be true in the future. His love is the only certainty, although He's given me so much more than that. That's why I'm a Christian, but you should see for yourself.
Before we wrap up.
Hello. So keep texting them in if you have any now. It's not too late. So firstly, weren't first century people much more open to the idea of resurrection because they didn't have the same scientific knowledge? How then can we be sure they didn't accept it blindly without fully researching the alternatives?
Great. Good question. Well, clearly first century people didn't have the scientific knowledge that we do today. But I would say you don't need a lot of scientific knowledge to know that dead people normally stay dead. Particularly dead people that have been crucified. So it's rather naive to say that they were that simple. There are certain things that people have known for longer than that. And also I would say that although Jewish people and Greek people had some kind of concept of life after death, the idea of physical resurrection of the kind that we see with Jesus didn't fit with either Jewish or the Greek philosophers of the time at all, which is why I would suggest those first followers of Jesus were so shocked and surprised by the resurrection. This wasn't what they expected to see happen. This wasn't what would have fitted with their expectations at all. And it's precisely because of that you've got to come to terms with what is going on here. What cataclysmic events so transformed the worldviews and the mindsets of these people, so much so that they're willing to go to their deaths for it. And what was it that was so convincing about what they said that despite the greatest efforts of the Jewish and Roman authorities, they couldn't stop this thing from going and moving? This wasn't supported for 300 years by the states until Constantine claimed to have become a Christian. Up until that point, Christianity is suppressed and persecuted, and yet people believe it because they're convinced it's true. And all of the evidence would have been to hand. So I think, give them the benefit of the doubt. They may not have had the scientific knowledge we have, but actually they knew that dead people die and stay dead. And that's why they were just so gutted. And something big has happened to convince them otherwise. And I don't think anything other than the resurrection would really satisfy them.
Okay, if Jesus rose from the dead, where is he now?
Really good question. And the Bible says, and if we'd actually read just the next few verses of Luke's book, the bits that finished it off, we'd have read what happened, that Jesus physically rose from the dead and has gone back to heaven. The Bible speaks about heaven as a physical reality. I think, by the way, if you want to kind of think that one through, because it kind of messes with our minds a little bit, try reading the Narnia books, because I think C.S. Lewis, as a Christian, tried to put into fiction what he believed about reality, which was you had two parallel physical worlds. You've got Narnia, you've got England. Sorry, Scots. But C.S. Lewis loved England more than Scotland. Although he did love Northern Ireland, I have to say, because he was born there. So maybe he loves Scotland too. But anyway, you had England, let's say Britain, you had Narnia, these two worlds side by side. And actually, the Bible says heaven is a physical reality. We're separate from it now, so we are blind to it in some ways. But Jesus broke into this world, and one day will come again. Now, it's hard for me to get my head around that, but if Jesus rose from the dead physically and the evidence points towards it, that's not such a big problem necessarily, is it? Jesus is physically present. Someone said this, when God became human, he didn't stop being God when he came into this world, the Christmas story. And when he went back to heaven, he didn't stop being human, that Jesus is still physically human. He's identified with us in our humanity and continues to do so, and one day will come too.
Okay, what about the conflicting accounts of the resurrection in the Gospels?
Yeah, some people have kind of problems. It's like, well, one of the Gospels says that only one of the women goes. You know, some of the Gospels say that several of the women go, things like that. Do they make sense? Now, if you were in a court of law, and those of you, if you're studying law, would know this, if you had 5 people coming in to give witness, and they all say exactly the same thing word for word, alarm bells would begin to ring, wouldn't they? You'd be thinking, hang on a minute, these guys have been sharing and, talking to each other, and they've come up with this story. So actually, an authentic witness is not one that says identically word for word what everyone else says, but someone who says something that's not contradictory but complementary. Not identical, but complementary. And I would say that whilst the gospel accounts don't give us identical accounts of the resurrection, they're not contradictory but complementary. Let me give you one example. One of the gospel accounts says that Mary goes to the tomb. Another gospel account says that Mary and some of the other women went to the tomb. And some people say, well, there you have it. It's a contradiction. Well, hang on a minute. The gospel account that says Mary goes to the tomb doesn't say Mary and only Mary and no one else goes to the tomb. It just tells us about Mary going there. It, of course, doesn't exclude the fact that Mary might have been going with others, but they were chosen to dwell on that one particular witness at that particular time. So it's an example of how actually they're not necessarily contradictory at all. And I think if you look at them side by side, and many people have done this, it's perfectly legitimate to say these are not contradictory accounts at all. They fit together quite happily if you're willing to do the work.
Okay, if God raised Jesus from the dead, why doesn't he raise other people from the dead, like loved ones who have died?
Yeah, and it's a good question, isn't it? Because I remember the first time I ever knew anyone dying, and it was my sister's best friend. I was about 5 years old at the time, and I just remember she'd been quite well, and then she'd gone to bed one night and she just died in her sleep. Absolute shock. I remember the shock as a 6-year-old thinking, she's gone. And you kind of think that your parents can sort everything out, but they can't. And I remember praying and saying, God, can't you do something? But you can't. Dead people stay dead. And there is that grief, that finality to death that is so awful, isn't it? No matter how we dress it up, whatever, people say things like, well, they're not really dead, they're just in the next room. Well, that's a fat lot of good if you can't get in the next room, isn't it? Jesus doesn't promise to bring people back to life now, much that I would love it. for some of the people that I know that have died. But he does promise that those who know and trust him will one day be raised to life just as he was. You know, in the Bible, there are several accounts of Jesus raising people to life. Lazarus, a 12-year-old girl, another person as well. I always think they're kind of unfortunate people because they were raised back to life, but they died again. I mean, Lazarus had 2 funerals. Jesus doesn't promise that he'll bring us back to life now, but he does promise that one day he'll take us through death to a life that will actually last and won't be destroyed by death ever again. That's the promise. And that's a wonderful hope that Jesus holds out. And so, although God might not do what I want him to do now, he has promised to do something even more wonderful and final and full one day.
Okay, and just to finish off, someone's texted in wondering if I can ask you if you could tell us why you're a Christian.
Really good question. Thank you for asking that. And probably a good one to kind of finish on at the end of the week. Why am I a Christian? There are lots of things that compel me to believe in Christianity. Firstly, because I'm convinced it's true. When I look at it, it makes sense of our world. It makes sense of my experiences of life. But it also makes sense of the historical evidence like nothing else does. When I look at the evidence of the resurrection, I find it compelling. And even though I've spent 23 years since I became a Christian being open and discussing and looking at the evidence for it, the more I do, the more I come to universities like this, the more I discuss it, the more compelled and convinced I am that it's true. That's the first thing. I'm convinced it's true. And secondly, I'm convinced it is wonderfully good news. I'm convinced that this gives us answers to the biggest problems of life that science, technology, and other philosophies and religions just don't do. It gives us an answer to the problem of my own sinfulness, my selfishness. It gives us me the hope of forgiveness and transformation. And it gives me the hope of life beyond death that makes life worth living now. And it's because I think it is true and it is good that I am a Christian. Some people say, well, isn't it too good to be true? And I want to say, no, actually, it's so good because it is true. Because it is based on something objective. It's not just a pipe dream. It is real. So that's why I am. Just before we finish, can I just say a couple more things? Sorry, I'm not going to wait for you to answer that, so I'm just going to carry on. You might say no. We've said a lot tonight. We've looked at the evidence. We've looked at the implications. There's a lot to think through. Maybe as you've come along this week, you've heard all this stuff and you thought, you know, that's all very interesting and it's been kind of intellectually interesting. I hope, though, you've begun to see that actually this might just be more than just intellectually interesting. This might be really important. Because this does make all the difference in life, death, and eternity. Let me just tell you one story. I grew up in Leicester, in the Midlands of England, and when I was about 18, got to know a family quite well, a couple, Barry, Paula, and their young kids. And lovely family, and I worked with them one summer. And then a year after, I went to college, to university, and I heard soon after that Paula had been diagnosed with cancer. She was obviously taken to hospital. She had chemotherapy and surgery. But no matter what they did, they just couldn't eradicate the cancer. And eventually they said, I'm sorry, but there's nothing more we can do. There's probably 3 months until you'll die. And actually she didn't live 3 months. She hardly made 3 weeks. And she did die. And she left behind Barry, her husband, and her kids. And a week later, they had the funeral. They lived just outside Leicester in a small village, and the funeral was in the village church. Tiny little church, absolutely packed full of the family, the friends, Barry, the children. And it got to that point at the beginning of the service when the coffin was brought into the front of the church, and a song was played over the loudspeakers. And it wasn't an unusual song to be played. It was a Christian song. It was well known to many of the people in the church. But what was unusual is that the person that was singing the song was actually Paula, the lady who had just died. And she had recorded it just a couple of weeks before her death. She knew she was going to die. And she'd actually requested that this be played as her body was brought in the coffin to the front of church. And the last verse of the song said this: "No guilt in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man could ever pluck me from his hand till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand. You see, for Paula, for Barry, for that family, the resurrection of Jesus wasn't just an interesting historical event. It was the basis of their hope. And it is for millions of people around the world today. And as I've said, it's not too good to be true. It's so good because it is true. And my question tonight, at the end of this evening and at the end of this week, is simply, what will your response be to it? Maybe you've come along at the beginning of this week and you were a real skeptic, and that's okay. Got nothing against skeptics, particularly skeptics who want to engage with the evidence, who don't want to be deluded by mere wishful thinking. Great. You know, there was a guy in the Bible that was a skeptic. He was one of Jesus' disciples. He was called Thomas. I think he was a real Eeyore character. He was always looking, glass half empty kind of person. And when the other disciples said that Jesus was risen from the dead, Thomas wasn't there, for whatever reason. And when they said that he was risen from the dead, Thomas wasn't having it. Unless I see with my eyes, unless I touch him with my hands, I will not believe it. And yet a week later, Jesus appeared to Thomas, Thomas the skeptic. Thomas, here I am. See me with your eyes, touch me with your hands, put your hand in my side, see the wounds. I'm alive, Thomas. In fact, we're never told that Thomas had to put his hand in Jesus' side. He saw, he believed. And he said, my Lord and my God. He was convinced. Maybe there are some of us that have come at the beginning of this week and we were skeptics, but maybe as the week's gone on, increasingly, although you hate to admit it, maybe you've been increasingly convinced. Or maybe like Thomas, it's come to the point where it's time to say, not just this might be true, but to say to Jesus, my Lord, my God, to make it personal. To receive all of this hope, all of this forgiveness, all of this life for yourself. And I just want to ask, what's stopping you from doing that tonight? There are some people that need to do that. Some of you are ready to do that. So as I finish, what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish just with a short prayer. And if you're in that situation, you've come to the point of saying, yes, I want to do something about this. I'd love to invite you to join me. Now, some of you might be saying, okay, but what about, I'm not absolutely sure it's true. Well, that's okay. You don't have to be 100% convinced it's true. When should you become a Christian? When actually the evidence stacks up so much that to reject it would actually be a bigger thing than to accept it. You've crossed 50%, as it were. It would be a bigger leap of faith to now walk away from it, given what you know. And some of you have got to that point. Or maybe some of you say, well, if I were to make that step, I don't know whether I could keep it up. I couldn't live as a Christian. And the great news is you wouldn't have to. Jesus said that because he's risen from the dead, that same power that raised him from the dead is now available to be in us by his Spirit, his unseen self. He'll come in and help us. You don't have to keep it up. He will help you. He will transform you. Maybe you say, well, I'm not good enough. Well, that's exactly the qualification you need. The realization you're not good enough. That's why Jesus came. Maybe you're saying, well, I'm just not sure I'm ready for the change. Following Jesus will change your life. Guarantee that. And following Jesus will probably mean that there's stuff to give up. I can guarantee that. But actually, Jesus says the stuff we give up is not the good stuff. It's actually the rubbish. It's the rubbish that destroys our life. We don't want to hang on to it anyway. And it's far outweighed by what we gain. We know God. We have a relationship with him. We have a new family. We have a life worth living and a death worth dying and a hope in eternity. What we lose is nothing in comparison with that. And so tonight, maybe some of you are actually ready. Well, if you are, then just as I pray, I'd love to encourage you to just pray with me. Just echo these words in your hearts. God, I'm sorry for keeping you out for so long. Thank you that you died for me and you rose again. Please come in, forgive me and change me. And give me this hope. Become my Lord and my God. Amen. Amen. Guys, thank you so much for listening. As we've done every night this week, we've got little feedback forms on your table. We'd love to know your feedback from tonight. So do pick those up now, just as Andrew comes back up to give the last notices, and start filling those out. Leave comments from tonight, from the week. I'd love you all to do that. Whether you've come before, whether you're a guest, whether you're part of the CU, leave some comments. And then on that little feedback form, 2 boxes at the bottom. You'll be used to me saying this if you've been before, but just bear with me for a second. The first box says, tell me more. If you're still not convinced, if you're still not ready to say, I want to get into this, I'd love you to come to that course called Uncover that's going to start next week. It's going to be an opportunity for you to investigate for yourself. So tick the box that says, tell me more. We'll phone you in the next 24 hours. We'll let you know about where that course is going to be. Come and investigate. At least I hope that by the end of this week, you've seen that this is worth checking out. So tick your box there. And then if you're saying, no, tonight I want to get started. I want to get involved. I want to get stuck in. Then tick the box that says, count me in. You're really saying, yeah, I want to get started with Jesus. Tick that box. And then if you leave a tick in either of those boxes, then obviously leave your name and your mobile number, and that'll help us to get in touch with you. We're not psychic, and we won't be able to do so unless you do that. But don't worry, we're not going to sell your details to anyone else, pass them on to a third party, or phone you up for the next 10 years. We will just tell you about that course that will be helpful for you. So fill that in. If you want to leave comments anonymously, you can, but do fill in the boxes if that will be helpful and if that applies to you. And then very finally, as with other nights, I'm just going to be cruising around down here with this little booklet called Yes. And for anyone tonight that said, yes, I want to get started following Jesus, I'd love to give this to you. It's absolutely free. It's written by a good friend of mine, and it's written for people in your situation who want to get started. It goes over what it is and how you can carry on from there. So as I wander around, just take one off me. I'd love to give it to you, and that would be really helpful for you. Thank you so much for having me, for having the team that have come to help this week. It's been a real pleasure and privilege being with you. And I really hope that although the week is coming to an end, actually for many of us, in regard to our journey with Jesus, this is just the start. So thank you.
Thank you.